And hello, everyone. Thanks so much for streaming with us here on ABC News Live. I'm Kira Phillips.
And I'm Terry Moran, live here at the Supreme Court, where in-person arguments for the first time since the start of the pandemic resumed on the day the court resumes its work. Big blockbuster term ahead. We want to get to other business first. Headlines including President Biden, who is he's ramping up pressure on the Republican Party, demanding help to pass a bill that raised the debt ceiling, something lawmakers have been historically able to pass for years. Brinksmanship, but no actual incident. Democrats have tried to pass debt limit on their own with just 50 votes, but they've been unsuccessful so far because of Republican filibuster. Republicans say they won't support more spending on Joe Biden's agenda, despite the fact that raising the debt ceiling simply allows the government to pay for spending that has already been approved. That's the Democratic argument, a lot of it under former President Trump.
That's right. And the U.S. seeing its first notable decline in new COVID cases and hospitalizations in more than 3 months. Dr. Anthony Fauci says the country is making progress against the current surge, but also warns caution going forward. All of this as a COVID-19 vaccination requirement for teachers and other staff members takes effect in New York City's public school system, all part of the mandates now being rolled out across the United States.
And Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp are all suffering from outages today, rendering services completely unusable for millions of people on those apps. The cause of this outage is unknown at this time. As a former manager at Facebook, a whistleblower, she's accused the company of allowing misinformation on its platform, which, according to the whistleblower, ultimately contributed to the January 6th Capitol riot in the United States and damages young people, especially young girls. Frances Hogan, who will testify before Congress tomorrow, said in an interview that the new algorithms that Facebook is using have been purposely pushing people to more divisive misinformation content while aiding the company's bottom line. They're trying to essentially make people angry to make themselves money. That's the allegation. Facebook has rejected those allegations, saying they're doing as much as they can reasonably do in a very complex and difficult problem, and it could take legal action against Hogan, the whistleblower in this case. But we're going to start with Supreme Court. This Supreme Court session, as I say, it's a blockbuster session. Abortion rights, gun rights, church, state, freedom of religion issues, all kinds of things before this court. We are really going to find out a lot about this court. The 3 Trump justices now sitting with the 6 others on this court, and we're going to learn just how far right President Trump and the other Republican presidents who have appointed these justices has been able to turn this court. Elections have consequences, and that's really what we're looking at. I want to bring in ABC senior Washington reporter Devin Dwyer, who's covering the court. We're going to go to his piece first, and here's Devin taking a look ahead at this term of the Supreme Court.
In rare rapid succession, the justices have been disavowing politics.
I think the court was thought to be the least dangerous branch, and we may have become the most dangerous.
The Supreme Court on a PR offensive.
We don't trade votes, and members of the court have different judicial philosophies.
Justice Amy Coney Barrett in a speech along Mitch McConnell insisting the court is not comprised of a bunch of partisan hacks. The blitz a sign of growing concern about the court's credibility.
Not since Bush against Gore has the public perception of the court's legitimacy seemed so seriously threatened.
Public approval of the Supreme Court has hit its lowest level in more than 2 decades, down 18 points from last year, sinking 9 points just since July. The court's 5-4 midnight decision in September to allow that Texas ban on nearly all abortions, only adding to public controversy.
Roe v. Wade is on thin ice. At the moment, it really feels more as if it's a question of when, not if, and how, not whether.
In a major case out of Mississippi this fall, the justices will decide whether to overturn nearly 50 years of abortion rights precedent. They'll hear cases on the death penalty, separation of church and state, and a major Second Amendment case that could establish a right to carry a handgun outside the home.
It would mean that you could expect more people to be carrying handguns in places like New York City, Boston, and Los Angeles.
The blockbuster cases playing out before the most conservative court in a generation. A 538 analysis found Justice Sonia Sotomayor is now the most liberal justice. Clarence Thomas remains the most conservative. But no longer is there one justice in the middle. There are three, all conservatives: Chief Justice John Roberts and Trump appointees Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett.
Barrett, for example, voted with Roberts and Kavanaugh over 90% of the time. She seems like she's going to be a core component of the conservative triad at the center of the court.
Democrats had sounded the alarm about Barrett.
A judicial torpedo they are firing at the ACA.
But she has so far defied expectations of both sides.
The expectation that Justice Barrett would be a reliable vote for the most doctrinaire originalist position has not materialized.
Brett Kavanaugh, the justice in the majority more than any other last term, is also a critical vote to watch.
We don't know what a Brett Kavanaugh, who is no longer beholden to John Roberts to get the deciding vote, will say about abortion. And we don't know the same about Justice Barrett.
Barrett and Kavanaugh broke with the Chief Justice to allow that Texas abortion law to go ahead on technical grounds. A sign John Roberts' once dominant influence may be coming to an end.
Whenever it's possible to find a narrow technical solution to a case, Chief Justice Roberts will encourage his colleagues to do it. Not all of them are on board with that.
A court at a crossroads as Americans remain on edge over just how far and how fast the Supreme Court will go.
All right, so now Devin Dwyer, who covers the court for us and was inside today, joins us. There's a great piece on just the magnitude of the term. But before we get to that, you were in the courtroom today, first time in a while.
It was surreal, Terry. I mean, I'll tell you, after 18 months of pandemic, the justices phoning it in remotely. They were back in person today. And I got to tell you, for an institution that you know well, steeped in tradition, almost frozen in time, so much has changed. Just the courtroom, the seating arrangement on the mahogany dais, completely transformed since Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing. We saw Amy Coney Barrett for the first time on the end, Justice Breyer, who's been in the media.
They play musical chairs.
That's right. They rotate by seniority.
The senior ones get to sit in the middle next to the Chief Justice, and the junior ones are out at the wings.
And Breyer seems so happy right there in the middle in his moment in the spotlight. The courtroom, the audience dramatically reduced. Usually hundreds of people are in that room, only a few dozen today. That was significant. And I noticed somebody in the front row. There were very few special guests, if any, but one was there, Justice Anthony Kennedy, a very popular retired justice, a man in the middle. I took it as something of symbolism, Terry, that perhaps this popular figure who is so revered among the justices and the public sort of giving the court a boost of confidence headed into a pretty feisty term.
And Justice Anthony Kennedy, one of the crucial votes on the case that upheld Roe versus Wade, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. I was in the courtroom when they read it out. He's gone, new court. Abortion back before this court in the biggest of ways, as you say. What are we expecting there?
Well, Mississippi is the biggest case of the year, Terry, not just for abortion, but overall. They'll hear that case in December. And on the surface, it deals with a 15-week abortion ban in that state. On the surface, unconstitutional. Everyone agrees with that under this court's precedent. But the fact that they took this case up after lower courts unanimously struck down that law suggests that the court is interested in taking a look at that precedent, re-examining Roe versus Wade. That has all those activists that were out here earlier so alarmed. And the state of Mississippi has invited them now to overturn it in whole or in part, calling Roe versus Wade egregiously wrong. And when they take this up in December, we'll get a real sense of whether they're prepared to do that.
Now, it is a big term that we're going to find out a lot about this case, about this court. The justices, conservative justices, look, the Republicans, despite not having won the majority of the American people's vote in elections for president since Ronald Reagan was president, because of the Electoral College and because of the accident of the timing and the departure of justices, they now control the court. We've been used to Chief Justice John Roberts trying to hold him in the middle. All bets are off now.
Right. He was the swing vote, the guy that sort of controlled which way this court went. Now it's really three justices, Terry. You've looked at the data. Analysts have looked at the data from the last term, how the justices have voted based on their ideology. It's three in the middle, John Roberts, Amy Coney Barrett, and Brett Kavanaugh, the institutional justices, if you will. These are three justices who are very concerned about their own reputations and the reputation of the court. It's at its lowest public approval rating in decades, and those three will have the power to shape which way this court goes in some of these divisive cases.
We've talked about abortion. A couple of the other big cases you're looking at.
Other big cases, Terry, aren't even on the docket yet. Things like the president's vaccine mandate nationwide. That's sure to rise up here on the shadow docket. Same thing with the DACA program for undocumented immigrants. A number of those will come. And then it's redistricting time across the country. Highly political process with the new census data. Those are not yet scheduled on this court's docket, but as you know full well, those are rest assured to come up through that emergency application process and will probably land here before too long.
A lot of big cases. And finally, that question, you touched on it. The popularity, the confidence in this court at an all-time low. There is a sense that Chief Justice Roberts tried to keep the court out of the muck and mud fight of our politics. Now, really, it looks like the country sees this as a political institution in many ways. What's at stake for the court as a whole?
Well, so much is at stake, Terry, and I think Justice Breyer speaks for a lot of the justices. We've heard them, as you saw in the piece, echo lately that they are not about politics, that this is about differences in ideology. A lot of different views on that and whether it's true, but they're concerned because the court's credibility, its legitimacy rests on how the public views them. And there's going to be a big fight ahead in a lot of these big cases. And looming over all of this, a presidential reform commission that could overhaul the court. They're due to give their recommendations next month.
President Joe Biden has been a little waffling on whether or not he would support the so-called court packing.
That's right. He opposed it. Now he's signaling he may be coming around.
Right. And it depends on how this term goes, I suppose. Certainly how the Democratic Party would react to that.
Absolutely.
Devin Dwyer, thanks very much for that. Kira, back to you.
All right, guys, thanks so much. And as the Supreme Court prepares to hear that major case on abortion, the woman known as Baby Roe is speaking out in an ABC News exclusive. 51-year-old Shelley Thornton opened up about the burden she has carried for decades. Here's our ABC News Live prime anchor, Lindsey Davis, with her one-on-one exclusive.
A lot of people didn't know that I existed.
For decades, she's been known simply as Baby Roe. Now, at 51 years old, Shelley Thornton is breaking her silence, talking exclusively to ABC News in her first broadcast interview.
Your mere conception brought about arguably the most controversial Supreme Court ruling in history. What's the impact on you now?
It doesn't revolve around me. I wasn't the one who, created this law. I'm not the one who created this movement.
Her biological mother was Norma McCorvey, a.k.a. Jane Roe, a cleaning woman from Katy, Texas. Her desire to terminate that pregnancy caused Norma to file a lawsuit against the state of Texas. She never did have that abortion, and by the time the Supreme Court ruled in her favor in 1973, the baby had already been adopted and was 2.5 years old.
My whole thinking is that, oh God, everybody's going to hate me because everyone's going to blame me for abortion being legal.
What kind of weight was that burden for you to carry that for so many years?
I feel that it was always hard for me to form relationships with people because I felt like I was always holding something back. I still carry that, and I probably always will.
There have been several challenges to the ruling, but none as serious as recent legislation passed in Texas, effectively banning most abortions. This morning, a new Supreme Court term is set to begin, and the constitutional right of a woman getting an abortion will largely rest in the hands of a conservative majority on the bench.
And our Lindsey Davis joining us now for more on this powerful interview. Lindsey, what struck you the most from your conversation with Shelley?
Yeah, I'd have to say it was her resolve on a number of fronts. Her resolve as far as never meeting her biological mother, Norma. They only spoke on the phone 2 or 3 times. Her resolve as far as really staying out of the abortion debate, and until now, really staying out of the spotlight. She really has this quiet confidence, this awareness, I think, really of who she is, despite the negativity growing up, despite this burden that she really carried and the secrets that she has carried. And I asked her about growing up with her adopted parents, and she talked about how they early on, from as early as she can remember, they told her that she was adopted, but they also told her she was chosen. And she says, most importantly, she felt loved.
And Lindsey, this is such a powerful interview, as Kira said. Why now, though? Why has she decided to come out at this moment and tell her story?
You know, for so long, she's 51 years old at this point, Terry, and for so long she says other people have been telling her story. And she says she felt like she was just a pawn. And she says, this is my story, and this is my story to tell. And as much as she has tried to hide it and bury it away, it continues to come back up. And so I think that now she's really thinking, okay, nothing else has worked. Now I'm just going to try and confront it head on.
And I thought we were going to hear a little bit of sound there. It sounded like you were tossing to a soundbite. I wanted to hear more, Lindsey. Well, look, this interview definitely comes at an ironic time that the Supreme Court is now facing what could be Roe versus Wade's biggest challenge yet. And as we heard in your piece, within your interview, it will largely rest in the hands of a conservative majority on the bench. I mean, this is one of the main reasons why Terry is there at the Supreme Court today, following what's happening in this new session. You know, this could be a major moment in history for women and women's rights.
No doubt. I mean, when you think about all of the watershed moments in this country, spurred by different decisions made at the Supreme Court, whether that's Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, those were all settled. It was like the court made a decision, they made a ruling, and America abided by that. And this is the one where January 22nd, 1973, when this was decided, people were out with their figurative pitchforks, ready to overturn it, ready to say, we'll be back. We're going to still have our day yet. There seems to still be this score that people want to settle. And I think that you saw even on the other side, the flip side over the past weekend, with tens of thousands of women who were marching, you know, holding signs saying abortion rights equal human rights. I mean, this is one kind of debate that just rages on, that it seems that the courts can't finally settle definitively.
And Lindsey, one of the facts of Shelley's life, of her life as she has chosen to live it, that you spoke to her about, was that she chose never to meet her biological mother, Norma Jane Roe, in the language of this court. Well, why not?
You know, she answered that question by saying she didn't deserve to meet me. She feels that there have been too many hurtful actions, too many hurtful words that Norma said, who she passed away at 69 years old back in 2017. But, you know, Norma was a really interesting figure who vacillated back and forth and flip-flopped a number of times, and not just as far as being pro-life or pro-choice, but also about her feelings about Shelley, her third daughter that she gave away for adoption. You know, at some point she told reporters that she just wanted to take her in her arms and love her and be her friend. And a few years later, she said, you know, I wish I had aborted her. And, you know, there are a lot of hurtful things that she said, that Shelley said, you know, she had the opportunity to meet her on a few occasions. In one of their phone calls, she said that Norma told her, you know, you should thank me that I didn't abort you. And she said, you know, I'll never thank you for that. And in fact, I asked her, have you forgiven her? Because at one point at 19 years old, Shelley said that, you know, she would never forgive Roe. I asked her, have you forgiven her yet? You know, we're talking about now more than 30 years later. She said, no, I still have not forgiven her. And Shelley remains, even though she is coming forward with this interview with us, you know, she remains really this unwilling participant in history. She really doesn't want the burden to carry this weight of people blaming her, she says, for abortion becoming legal in this country.
Tell you what, you could feel the tension within that interview. It was just so well done and so interesting, and we can't wait to see the entire piece. Lindsey, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kira.
And you can see more from Lindsey's exclusive interview tonight on ABC News Live Prime, 7 p.m. Eastern, 8 Pacific, and later tonight on Nightline on ABC. You do not want to miss this. Well, coming up, Texas has among the strictest voting laws in the country. Up next, the law professor who calls the Lone Star State's voter ID law racist. The potential national impact when we return.
And welcome back. I'm here at the Supreme Court. We're going to switch to Texas right now. Today is the deadline for people who want to vote in the state of Texas to register for statewide elections there next month. And voting rights advocates say that thousands of voters, mostly minority voters, are at risk of being disenfranchised after that state passed a strict new voter ID law. We caught up with one voter who says he's going to miss that deadline and says the law is to blame. Here's our Alex Perche on the story of one voter in Texas and what it tells us about voting rights there.
For 82-year-old Elmira Hicks, driving has gotten harder lately. She can still do it just fine, but she's had to battle getting her license renewed.
My ability to get a license is completely impossible.
Texas, like other states, requires a birth certificate for a real ID. Ms. Hicks was born at a time when those records weren't always kept.
I do feel like the laws right now are targeting my mother and other African Americans in this country.
She and her daughter battled in court, a judge even ruling in their favor. Still, technicalities have kept her from getting a license. She also says it will keep her from voting. Today, a critical deadline to register to vote in the state's next election in November. On the ballot, 8 amendments ranging from taxes to judicial eligibility. Amendments that Ms. Hicks won't be able to vote on.
I can't vote without a proper identification. My voice does not count. They've completely shut me down.
It's actually very common for individuals not to be able to get their birth certificates.
People have died just to vote. People have stood in line and in the rain. Women fought to vote. And now I can't vote.
In this country, race correlates to a lot of different characteristics. So, for example, if you take voter identification laws, which we've been talking about, people of color, so African Americans, Latinos, will be less likely to have the underlying documents that you need in order to get the ID in the first place, so in order to get a driver's license.
And Texas recently passed one of the most restrictive voting laws in the country. It bans drive-through voting, has new ID requirements for mail-in voting, and has new regulations for early voting hours. It's a law Professor Fernita Tolson specifically called racist during a congressional subcommittee hearing because she believes it disproportionately impacts black and brown voters.
What voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
We expanded the number of hours for people to vote. We expanded the number of days so people could vote.
State Representative Steve Toth supports the new law expanding voter ID requirements.
The recourse is, if they can't get a driver's license, to go to DPS with a Social Security card or some other ID, and to get an ID so that you can vote. It's free.
Toth admits most people register to vote using their driver's license. And in the case of Ms. Hicks, going through the extra hoops of obtaining a voter identification card isn't so easy. She lives in a rural area, and without her license, she can't drive herself to the Department of Public Safety.
All right, and joining me now is ABC's Alex Perche. So, Alex, I want to ask you, there's a great piece about what's going on in Texas. Let me ask you about some polling. A new poll shows that 62% of Democrats actually support photo ID requirements for voting, along with 87% of independents and 91% of Republicans, of course. So there is this bipartisan support for what seems a pretty common sense, a lot of people, pretty common sense way of securing the integrity of elections, just a photo ID. What's the counter argument that voting rights advocates are making there for people like the ones that you've talked to who might struggle to get it?
Well, Terry, what's interesting is voter ID laws aren't anything new, right? But critics would point out that what they call restrictive voter ID laws are what's new. And something that Professor Tolson had mentioned is that it's kind of reductive to say that all voter ID laws are bad or are racist. But take, for instance, in Texas, where they have new requirements for mail-in voting. Well, that same poll that you quoted, about 84% of Democrats said that they back making mail-in voting easier. It was less than 30% of Republicans. So that's where we're seeing some of the disconnect here.
And mail-in voting has not been, so far, found to encourage widespread fraud, although there are concerns about that. And this is a subject that may come here to this court and certainly has been in the past. ABC's Alex Perche, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
So coming up, a giant oil spill off the coast of Southern California, shutting down beaches and devastating wildlife. The response of the state and an investigation straight ahead.
And welcome back. This hour, that massive oil spill off the coast of Southern California is closing beaches and devastating wildlife. More than 144,000 gallons of crude oil already poured into the Pacific Ocean as cleanup crews race to contain the damage. Chief National Correspondent Matt Gutman is on the shore there in Huntington Beach, California.
Terry, hey. So we're on a boat. Right behind me is Newport Beach. And north of us over there is where the oil spill happened. We just came out of it. And you might be able to make out that the surface of the water looks kind of flat. That's because you're seeing oil sheen. It only takes a teaspoon of oil to create sheen on an area about the size of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So it doesn't take a lot to have an effect. What we know so far, officials telling us that up to 144,000 gallons have leaked so far. They managed to seal the pipeline on both ends. They believe that it has stopped leaking, but the maximum amount they believe is 144,000 gallons. They don't know if that much has leaked so far. And in surveying the coastal waters just a couple miles off the shore, you go through a lot of areas that look like this, but also areas where you see these tar balls. And this is not a cocktail. This is the oil I just scooped up with my hands from the water. Some of them are massive. I didn't get those. And some are much smaller. And when you leave them in a cup, they basically recongeal back into this oil. And that's what wildlife officials are so concerned about. Shorebirds and other animals will dive through this kind of stuff to get to fish below. They get it on their face. Once they get it on their feathers, especially birds, it prevents them from warming up. So they get cold, they get weaker, and that's how they die. They're less concerned about sea lions and bottlenose dolphins and whales at this point because they're much better at navigating it. But they say that the way oil works, it lingers on the surface for weeks, even months, and that could affect the food chain here. So we won't know the real fallout to wildlife for possibly months. Coast Guard officials and California Fish and Wildlife say it'll take probably weeks to assess the damage here. But again, you see the mountain boats, not where we are anymore, but they do have these boats. They're trying to corral the oil using those booms, which just kind of try to skim it off the top. They're using other mitigations as well. But right now, they simply don't even know the scope of this spill. Back to you.
And we're going to follow it, Matt, for sure, and also the investigation clearly to follow. Our Matt Gutman, thank you so much. And as you saw, Matt just reported, this spill has sent more than 144,000 of gallons of oil just oozing into the major beaches there across the state of California. Beaches all along the coast now shut down, already affecting wildlife. You saw the pictures there of the dead birds and the fish just washing up on the shores. It's heartbreaking. And thankfully, that pipeline has been capped, no longer leaking into the ocean. But the damage, as you can see, is already done. And it's damage my next guest knows all too well. I actually had the privilege of being embedded with him on the ground in New Orleans as he directed the federal response to Hurricane Katrina. I also spent months with him out there in the Gulf of Mexico as he led us through the Deepwater Horizon oil spill as the National Incident Commander. Retired Coast Guard Admiral Thad Allen joining us now to talk about the devastating spill in Southern California. I'll tell you what, Thad, unlike Deepwater Horizon, which, as you remember, I remember well, gushed for 85 painful days. And this leak was detected and stopped immediately, and the pipeline was drained. But the harm is done. So what's the fate of that oil now, and how damaging do you think it will be?
And part of this thing is to stop the discharge, and that apparently has been done. I'm sure there's going to be some checking to make sure they achieve that. But the fate of the oil gets rather complicated because it comes to the surface under different wind, sea, and tide conditions. It doesn't become a monolithic spill that you can attack from all sides. It's tens of thousands at times of patches of oil. And what you really want to do is try and address that oil on the water through mechanical means or other means to the best of your extent, because the last place you want to fight an oil spill is on the shore.
So the Coast Guard, as you know, has recovered more than 3,000 gallons of oil from the water as of Sunday night, which means there's still a lot of work to do. Talk to us about the scope of this kind of operation, Thad, and what's going to, happen now moving forward with regard to the cleanup. What's it going to take?
Well, what it really takes is a unified effort. Under the current laws in the United States, the Coast Guard has the federal lead in coordinating the response because many of these spills operate in maritime transportation systems where there's federal jurisdictions. But it's critical to have the state and the local authorities involved in it because they are involved in planning ahead of time to deciding what parts of the coastline are the most important in terms of fragile ecosystems and how they need to be protected. And that's what's happening right now. So the resources that are being deployed are trying to stop the oil offshore and then protect those most valuable resources in close to shore. And they've got a number of boats, aircraft up, and over 300 people on shore right now, as I understand it.
And Admiral Allen, as we heard from Matt Gutman, they've capped this pipeline, or they've staunched the flow of it, but they still don't know the scope of the damage. But more importantly, perhaps going forward, they don't know the cause of it. So there's going to be, as Kira says, an investigation. How does that investigation work? What are they looking for, and how do they find it?
Well, there are actually multiple authorities and jurisdictions. Most of the infrastructure on the outer continental shelf is regulated at the federal level by the Department of Interior. There are also equities from the National Transportation Safety Board because it is a transportation incident involving the transportation of oil. And then the state and local authorities also have jurisdictions. So there'll be a number of inquiries, and the key will be to get this information together and find out the source of the leak and the extent of the leak. My guess is they're still trying to determine whether or not they've exactly located the source and stopped it and make sure there is no chance of further discharge. But there will be multiple investigations moving forward.
Yeah, I'd also like to know when the last time that pipeline was inspected. I talked to Orange County Supervisor Katrina Foley, Thad, and she told me this morning that the spill is just irreversible, referring to the wildlife killed by the spill and the habitats that have already been impacted by the oil. What can be done now to mitigate the repercussions of this spill on the environment?
Well, it's literally a defense in depth, starting offshore and dealing with it as far as you can. And then if you have to, there are plans where you can channel the oil into beaches where there is sand and you can physically remove the sand. The last thing you want is oil into sensitive wildlife areas or estuaries where there's further ecological damage and then obviously the chance of a catastrophic loss of wildlife and so forth.
And I mentioned, go ahead, Terry.
Admiral, excuse me, and excuse me, Kira, but one of the issues here for so many people for whom climate change and the environment are right up at the top of their politics, especially young people. They wonder, they look at something like this, unused to it perhaps, and they wonder, is it possible to secure a pipeline, to build a pipeline that is foolproof, that really can be made not to spill? Or is this just really the risk of doing business still and for a long time forward with fossil fuels like this?
I think I've been asked that question 100 times over my career. And the truthful answer is there's no risk-free way to extract fossil fuels from the earth. The question is, what is an acceptable level of risk for the value obtained for the resources? And that inevitably involves a discussion that has to include the local regional area and the assessment by the stakeholders and the people that are there about the value of what you're able to gain from the resources versus the risk that's there. But there is no risk-free way to extract fossil fuel from the earth.
Admiral Thad Allen, it's always great to have your insight. You have been through a lot of these disasters, and we always appreciate you giving us your thoughts. Thanks so much, Thad.
Thank you.
Finally, Terry, there you are at the Supreme Court. You've been there, well, since very early this morning. It's back in session in person for the first time in about 18 months. So what do you think? What's standing out to you? What are you paying close attention to as we head into the evening as the new term begins?
Kira, it's a new term, and I'm wondering, is it a new chapter, a new era in the history of the Supreme Court? There have been times in our history, in our country's history, where the Supreme Court has been very important, right at the forefront of national life, the civil rights era, and other times It's been irrelevant in most people's lives, where most decisions kind of come and go and people aren't paying much attention. There are times when it's been highly admired, when it's been reviled by many Americans. I think over the past decade and more, Chief Justice John Roberts has tried to steer a steady course, but it certainly looks like the storm is coming here, given what the Republican Party wants from the justices it has appointed, for what the Democratic Party have vowed to oppose and maybe even change the nature of this court. It looks like rough waters ahead here for sure. Kira?
We'll be wading through them. That does it for this hour. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Kira Phillips.
And I'm Terry Moran. We'll see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern back here. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.